Hi folks, today's presentation is entitled South Africa, Penalty for Late Payment of Tax. Now we all know that taxes are meant to be paid, and if we don't pay them, there has obviously got to be some reaction from the authorities to either collect the tax or to punish us by disallowing our contract or whatever it may be. Now, South Africa was first settled in 1652 when Jan van Riebeeck arrived. I'm very lucky. I've got a bunch of very early documents, and I've looked through these early documents to find out how they handled late payment of tax. And I haven't found anything in the early documents. Of course, the first settler legislation was for the Cape of Good Hope. You see here a section in my library where we've got the documents going right back to 1652. And I've been looking for how they dealt with non-payment of taxes. I don't know, maybe they had a death penalty, but there's nothing in the early statutes. The earliest document I could find was the Cape of Good Hope Stamps and Licenses Act No. 3 of 1864. In the Act, we see here in section 14 that if tax is due upon a taxable document, you have up to 21 days to pay the tax. If after 21 days you have not paid the tax, then you can affix an adhesive stamp to the value of double the tax payable, and you can pay it before 42 days has expired. If you failed to pay the tax after 42 days, you must affix an adhesive stamp to the value of triple the tax payable, and then you have up to 62 days. It doesn't describe what happens beyond 62 days. Now, this legislation was evidently seen by Alan Drysdale. Drysdale was the author of the book Transvaal Revenue and Telegraph Stamps, published in 1995. He assumed, quite reasonably, that the stamps he had seen in circulation with a penalty overprint were the stamps that had been issued by the Cape Colony for the purpose of collecting this tax. In this section from his book, he writes, at first, payment of such penalties was accounted for with revenue stamps, but in 1874, revenue stamps overprinted penalty specifically for such use were introduced in the Cape Colony. They were affixed to the document in addition to revenue stamps to indicate the penalty paid. He then goes on to say that after Union, in the interprovincial period, they could have been used in the Transvaal, his area of interest, but he says to date none has been reported. In fact, none has been reported from the Cape either, and his speculation here, while seeming reasonable, was untrue. The stamps had indeed been overprinted, and this is the 1874 £10 stamp. But the truth is that the stamps were only overprinted in 1911. While it may be true that the penalty overprinted stamps were not used, these 4 stamps belong to a collector in the Netherlands. They look as if they've all been overprinted in manuscript in the same hand, and two of the stamps are inscribed Boete, meaning penalty. It is very probable that these stamps were all used on a document for which the tax was paid late and the penalty was paid with the manuscript Boete overprinted stamps. However, it's still true we haven't seen any documents with revenue stamps overprinted Boete and evidently used for payment of the penalty. A similar assumption had been made by Sherwood in his earlier publication, the South African Revenue Stamps Catalogue. As you'll see here, he suggests that the £10 we've just seen was overprinted in 1874, and in 1898, the Hope Standing issue was also overprinted penalty. Here we see the two stamps that he's referring to. One slight correction: he indicated they were overprinted in black, but in fact they were overprinted in red. And the second correction, they were overprinted in 1911, after Union and for use throughout South Africa. Similar legislation was passed for the Orange River Colony. The declaration here says that double the tax should be paid or treble after 42 days, but it doesn't indicate that it should be paid with stamps. How it should be collected, I don't know, and I've never seen an underpaid document from the period. Here we see similar legislation from the Transvaal. They don't describe a 42-day or 21-day limit here. They simply say that if it's not paid when it should be paid, then the extra tax will be not less than 3 times the amount of the unpaid duty. But it does go on to say, such penalty shall be denoted by means of stamps, to be affixed by the officer who stamps the instrument, and to be defaced by him, together with the stamps denoting the duty. For this document, I must acknowledge assistance from Fernando Torres. Fernando is a recognized Transvaal expert, and Fernando advises that he's aware of 3 documents where the unpaid tax was paid with a penalty stamp, not an overprinted stamp, but a general revenue stamp, and a hand stamp cachet next to it, rendering the document now valid. This is an IOU of 1907. The 1 shilling tax was due in August, but was only paid in November. A 5 shilling stamp has been applied. You'll see from the cachet it describes it as the correcting penalty, and goes on to read, this instrument is now certified to be correctly stamped. This page shows something similar. In the Transvaal Philatelist in 2001, they had a short article about the Dodd collection, lodged in the Open Air Museum in Pretoria. And this is one of the documents in the Dodd collection. You'll see, once again, the tax has been paid. There's a 5 shilling revenue stamp applied to pay the penalty. And on the reverse of the document, we have the same hand stamp that we saw before. So much for Transvaal. I've been looking for something similar from Natal. I contacted two of the Natal subject matter experts, Keith Klugman and Roger Porter. Unfortunately, neither of them was aware of any documents bearing stamps to pay penalty for late payment on any Natal documents. If any of you out there have such documents, I'd love to hear from you. Shortly after Union in 1910, the provinces got their act together, and a single act, Act number 30 of 1911, finally formalized the payment of penalties. This slide summarizes the situation. You'll see that now, up to 3 months late, in other words, from 21 days to 90 days, the penalty was half of the unpaid duty. But there was a minimum penalty of 2 shillings and sixpence. Since most documents were inexpensive for taxation purposes, this then became by far the most common usage, 2 and sixpence penalty minimum fee. You'll see from 3 to 6 months, it was 100% or 5 shillings. 6 to 12 months, double the duty, 5 shillings. Over 12 months, triple the duty, 10 shillings, minimum penalty. The maximum fine that you could get was £50. So if you were due over £50, as maybe double or triple the unpaid duty, you had to go to court. You couldn't resolve it just by paying in the Revenue Office. An overprint reading penalty was applied to the current King Edward VII revenue stamps. You'll see each of the stamps in the Edward VII set here. We've seen the Queen Victoria penalty stamps earlier, when we read that it had been assumed that they were issued in Victorian times. In fact, these were residual stocks of stamps in stock at the Cape of Good Hope, and they were supplied to be overprinted for use as penalty stamps. An interesting variety is this blackish overprint on the £10. I submitted it to the Royal Philatelic Society for certificate, and their conclusion was the overprint was somewhat oxidized. The stamp is still gummed, so it hasn't been abused in any way, but maybe it's been subjected to some chemical treatment, who knows. In about 1913, old stocks of Transvaal 2 and sixpence revenues were similarly overprinted penalty. I'm not aware of any documents surviving, but this example here is on peace. There's about half a dozen examples recorded. Maybe the Cape stamps were exhausted and a small number of Transvaal stamps were overprinted at the end, before the Union of South Africa issued its own revenue stamps. A number of used examples from the 1911 set have been recorded. However, in my experience, we've only come upon 3 examples on full document. This is one of them. It's a power of attorney that was issued on 8th of August 1911, but the tax was only paid in November. The tax due on a power of attorney was 1 shilling, but here we have a 2 and sixpence penalty stamp applied alongside to collect the fine. Government Notice 1399 of 6 September 1913 reported that new Union revenue stamps had been introduced on the 1st of September. It is also reported that several duties were overprinted penalty, although it's not confirmed that the penalty stamps were issued on the same day. Archives refer to this issue as the 1913 issue. You'll see the colour of the £1 was changed. You'll also see that these are all used stamps. It was not permitted to buy mint penalty overprinted stamps because of the chance of fraud. When you had to authenticate a document and pay the tax, you went into the Revenue Office, they agreed the tax, you paid the money, and by affixing and cancelling the stamps, they agreed that the document was now legitimate. At least 3 duties are recorded overprinted in manuscript. Those with legible cancellations have been attributed to Southwest Africa, but it is possible that some of the manuscript overprints may have been overprinted in the Union of South Africa. So here's a few examples of normal usages. This is a power of attorney. Tax of 2 shillings was due on 19 April 1918, but only paid on 14 June. 2 and 6pence minimum charge. The overprint, the penalty overprint, is misplaced to the left. This is a promissory note dated 2 May 1923. The tax was due on the 6th of August. The document was signed on the 9th of April, and the 1 shilling tax was only paid on the 2nd of May. Again, 2 and 6pence minimum charge. This is a last will and testament. Tax due 14 December 1929, paid on 16 January 1930, 2 and 6pence minimum charge. The tax on this power of attorney was due on 2nd of April 1927, but was only paid on the 27th of September. So now we have a 5 shilling penalty for late payment. The signatory here, William Carstens, was a very important man in Port Nolloth. Among his many business interests, he had a concession to milk euphorbia bushes in Namaqualand. Here we have a concession granted to Carstens and then ceded to somebody called Kamail, then further ceded to Namaqualand Rubber Company on 17th of October. The document tax for each of the concessions was 1 shilling, but in fact the taxes were paid 4 years late. So the 4 shilling tax charged for each of the concessions is underpaid. It should have been 10 shillings. It is unusual to see denominations less than 2 and 6pence because 2 and 6pence was the minimum charge. Maybe here they only had 2 shilling stamps in stock, but it doesn't really make sense. Here's another document that went through the taxation process twice. It's a bond which was issued in the 3rd of June 1921, and the 19 shillings tax is correctly paid and the adhesives are on the reverse. The bond was ceded on 8th of February 1924, and 3 shillings worth of revenue stamps were applied. The bond was ceded again to another party in September 1927, and once more 3 shillings in revenue stamps were applied. However, in each case, the tax should have been 4 shillings instead of 3 shillings, and in 1930 an additional shilling stamp was applied for each of the sessions, and a 10 shilling penalty stamp was applied for each of the sessions. Here we see our friend William Carstens once again ceding the rights to milk euphorbias in Namaqualand. The tax, as before, was 1 shilling, but the tax was paid 2 years late. And the 10 shilling penalty is paid here with 4 2 and 6pence penalty stamps. Mr. Carstens features prominently in the internet, and he died in 1949 in his 90s. This is another very late payment. It's for the sale of a property known as Titi's Bay in 1924, but the tax was only paid in 1928, hence the imposition of a penalty of 10 shillings. This is an unusual document. It's a bankruptcy settlement. The signatory, Hunter Kennedy, cedes all his assets to his creditors. On the reverse is a list of the creditors, how much they are owed, with signatures indicating that they will accept the reduced payment described in the settlement. This acceptance was dated 19 June 1923, and it bears a 5 shilling revenue stamp on the reverse. The original document here is dated 13 December 1922, but the shilling document tax was only paid in January 23, hence the imposition of the 2 and 6pence penalty stamp. It was less than 3 months late. The document was hand-stamped at the Master's Office of the Insolvency Branch. However, rather curiously, the document also bears a £1 revenue stamp, which was superfluous, possibly applied as a result of a misunderstanding on tax rates, and the manuscript endorsement by the stamp reads, "This pound stamp is not required, has not been acted upon, and may be refunded. Signed by the Master of the Supreme Court." This document was once described as the most interesting document of the first overprinted penalty set. Maybe not the case anymore after subsequent discoveries, but a lovely document anyway. It's a bond of security, dated 17 October 1916. The document was originally signed in June 1916, but the tax only paid on 17 October. The penalty here is receipted with 3 2 and 6pence stamps and 4 of the £1 blue and grey penalty stamps. Penalty was 100% of the original tax, because it was 3 to 6 months overdue, so the original tax had to be £4 7 and 6pence. Now the top of the document is missing, but to balance out, it is speculated that the missing stamps were a 2 and 6pence, a 5 shillings, a 10 shilling, and 3 £1 revenue stamps, so that the tax paid and the penalty were equal. There was a very important discovery some years ago. A paper recycler was visiting the old Eastern District Sporting Club, and he was clearing away all the waste paper. And in among the white waste paper, he found a ledger. And he was smart enough to separate the ledger from the other waste paper, and he contacted the internet, and he asked, "Is this anything special?" I saw his communication on Facebook and made contact with him privately. He gave me a little more information about his find. He told me he didn't want to sell it to a dealer. He wanted to sell it to a collector because the comments he had received on Facebook so far told him he had an important discovery. I travelled out of town. I actually travelled with a dealer to meet the gentleman. Here he is. I have no permission to show his face, so I've blocked it out. He's holding the ledger, and he's opened it at one of the pages. This ledger was a series of receipts for investments in the racing company in Germiston. The tax had been paid when people bought shares in the company, but the tax had been wrongly calculated. And at a later date, they had corrected it and paid the balance of the tax. On his left-hand page, you'll see the additional stamps from the balance of the tax paid on that particular share certificate. Now, it doesn't look as if the book has ever been opened since then, because the colours were pristine. There were 50 pages in the book, many of them duplicated because people had bought the same number of shares. But I was fortunate in having the first attack on the book, and I've retained a few of the pages which I'll show you now. This is an example of one of the share certificates. The shares were issued on 25 January 1922, and tax was paid at the rate of sixpence for £50 or part thereof, and revenue stamps were applied. However, the tax rate should have been 1 shilling per £20. And so on the reverse of each of the share certificates, we see the balance of the tax due, and we see copies of penalty stamps because the tax was paid late. So here's an example of the reverse of one of the share certificates. If we blow up the stamps, you'll see that in this particular case, the tax underpayment was 6 shillings and sixpence. So the Inland Revenue Office has applied 6 shillings and sixpence worth of revenue stamps and 6 shillings and sixpence worth of penalty stamps. It's interesting to note that the sixpence on the upper and lower sixpenny stamps is in a different font. But that's a whole topic for another day. Here we see something similar. £4 worth of revenue stamps and £4 worth of penalty stamps. Beautiful. This is similar. We have £1.13 and sixpence worth of revenue stamps and £1.13 and sixpence worth of penalty stamps. Here's another example showing the share certificate reduced in the photocopy on the right and the reverse illustrated behind. If we look at the stamps that are on the reverse, we see there are 3 £1 penalties and a £5 penalty. I am only aware of 3 intact documents bearing £5 penalty stamps from this series, and all 3 were in this ledger. This is another spectacular document from the ledger, and this one here bears 2 copies of the £5 penalty overprint. Sometime in the late 1920s, we see these stamps overprinted Boete, which is penalty in Afrikaans. Less than 10 have been recorded. It is probable that the introduction of this Afrikaans-only overprint was an attempt to satisfy JBM Hertzog, who had become Prime Minister in 1924. Hertzog had actively campaigned for Afrikaans to be accorded equal status to English from his early days as Minister of Education in the Orange Free State. Only one document is recorded where the Boete overprinted stamp has been used. You see it here. It's a power of attorney granted to R.W. Johnson of Johannesburg to sell land owned by the Missionary Society of Southern Rhodesia. The affidavit was signed in England. You'll see here that the 10-shilling tax was the tax on an affidavit in UK. The document was verified by the Lord Mayor of London, Sir Kynaston Studd, who charged 1 shilling, and you'll see the Justice Room stamp here, for his service of authorising a document. The document was then sent to Johannesburg. In Johannesburg, 1 shilling tax was paid, which was the tax on a power of attorney. However, the journey to South Africa had taken 7 weeks, and so it was longer than 21 days after the original date of granting the power of attorney, and so a penalty stamp of 2 and 6pence was also applied. The first penalty set was replaced in 1931. I believe this was possibly the last printing before the new issue came out. And you'll see the date stamp is 24 January 1931. The interesting factor is that penalty is now at the top of the stamp. Was this a positioning error? Or did they plan that had the set continued, they would be printing at the top in future? I found 2 other copies, January 1931, February 1931, possibly all from the same printing, but my theory is that they planned to move from penalty at the bottom to penalty at the top. But this never happened because a new set of stamps came out in 1931. 2 and 6pence was the most common duty, and so it's the duty that would have attracted the most reprints. And that concludes the presentation. The best listing you're going to find of these stamps is shown at the website down at the base of the page here, www.revd.com. The listing shows pictures of all the recorded penalty stamps that we've seen to date. It's not just a theoretical listing. I recommend it. Cheers to all of you. Bye.